by Wrap Pro. I am the Wrap's assistant managing editor for audience, Adam Chitwood, and I am thrilled to be joined by House of the Dragon showrunner Ryan Condal. Ryan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to start off by asking a few questions we've been asking all of our innovators this year, and it begins with, what's the biggest hunch or bet that has paid off despite what everyone has told you?
Making a Game of Thrones sequel, prequel. Honestly, within the construct of this particular show, I think it was the multiple time periods and being able to tell that story cohesively, seamlessly as far as it goes when you're recasting characters, casting multiple sets of actors to play the same role, all within the same season. I think we looked at what The Crown did and really admired it, and I think it's one of the shows that certainly I, as the showrunner, and lead writer, certainly when we were in the room, pointed to The Crown as one of our references in terms of the kind of drama that we were aspiring to create, and I think an aspiration just in terms of the what I think is a high watermark in the art form, and The Crown is very successful at taking well-known characters and then recasting them. They did it between seasons. We did it in the midst of the season. I think that was the big thing, is just doing it mid-season and with a brand new show, and trusting that the audience would sink their teeth into the characters and then stay with you as you swap them out. And so far, I think it's paid off.
I'd say so. Looking back over your career, what's been your biggest mistake, and what you learned from it?
I don't know. Can I make a joke about not going and getting my MBA? I don't know. This business is a series of mistakes that you make, I think, along the way, and it's in many ways, I think it's a pursuit. It's kind of a Zen pursuit where you're never going to quite achieve perfection, nirvana, but the continual self-improvement and learning from things that you've done in the past that have not worked, and then also learning from things that have worked and continuing them as best practices as you move along. And I think it's so hard to point at one kind of singular thing along the way, but my TV career began with a busted pilot that we shot and made and that no one ever saw. So I think that in itself was, if we consider that I think that was many failures that led to a bigger failure. But I think if that was the one of never wanting to find myself there again, and doing whatever I could do to not repeat that, that would be the big one for me, at least in TV.
Well, how has 2022 forced you to innovate in ways you didn't expect?
Oh, they gave it to you.
This whole COVID thing was a real doozy through all production. Thankfully now it seems like most of the things that really held us up, I think, in the making of season one, the writing, the prep, the making of season one, because it all, COVID happened in the midst of our writers' room. The declaration of the pandemic and all that. So really through every phase of the show, we dealt with it. We dealt with it in casting, not being able to see actors in the room live. We dealt with it certainly in pre-production, not being able to be in the room with the artists and designers that were building your sets. And then in actual production, all the limitations that came along with that, not being able to meet people or get to know them because half their face was covered, and then multiple shutdowns and things like that. So I think it's just sort of figuring out, we're very adaptable people, us humans, and taking the things that you've learned from doing this job and then figuring out, okay, well, I have to live without that. So how do I do that better? And then moving on. I think the exciting thing about 2022 is now, as we kind of come into the end of it, is moving on into what apparently appears to be the positive next phase of life in movie making, which is a little bit more normal, and being excited, frankly, to just get back to the quote unquote regular business of filmmaking with everybody in the room and being able to see their faces.
Whose work has really inspired you, either inside your field or outside of it?
I mean, I grew up really loving movies. In particular, for me, certainly George Lucas and all that he accomplished, in certainly Star Wars, but I think just him as an innovator in his own right. And I always loved George Lucas as a fan and a nerd. But I think once I started doing this for a living and realized all the things that he did, the things that you don't necessarily credit him with, like building ILM, inventing so many kinds of special effects, the technology that he had to invent just to make Star Wars. I think those are the things that I, as a producer, really came to admire, and those are the people that I sort of gravitate to. James Cameron, certainly along that list. John Milius was always somebody that I really looked up to as a screenwriter. And then on the TV side, I think I look to more kind of recent peers in the sort of quote unquote golden age of television, or the new golden age of television. David Milch and David Simon and David Chase, all the Davids, certainly. Matt Weiner in the creation of Mad Men. Those are the TV series that, for me as a movie fan, somebody that really pursued movie making wholeheartedly, when I started seeing those as a budding screenwriter, those were the things that made me want to get into long form TV making and tell these kind of movie scale stories on a longer timeline. Be able to live in with the characters and the drama in a bit more in-depth way than you would be able to do in a 2-hour feature.
This is not on the list, but it must be asked. What's the best Star Wars movie?
I mean, it's got to be the original, right? I mean, A New Hope, or Star Wars, I think, as fans from 1977 would remind you that it was called. Because that was the innovation. That was the one that broke the mold. It took this very bleak period in American history. I think in the late 70s, and also in kind of movie making, a really interesting period, because we were making all these films like Taxi Driver and All the President's Men and Network, and Lucas brought a more optimistic bent to that, to kind of counterpoint the movies that have been made for the last decade. And I think that that leap forward in genre storytelling and making it a high art form, the way Kubrick had done with 2001, that's the one that changed film more than The Jazz Singer did, I think. So that was the big one.
And if you could go back to the start of your career, what advice would you give yourself?
Stay at it. I think I would always say that I always envied doctors and lawyers, because they had an incredibly hard job that took years and years of schooling, but there was a set path to it. Really, if you really wanted to become a doctor, you could get into the trenches and study the material, prepare for the tests, take the extra courses, read books, meet with mentors, and you in theory, if you could pass everything, you would get there. There was a path to it. I think with this, it's such an unknown thing. Everybody has a different breaking in story, and then so many people break in and then wash out later, which I felt like that was the more heartbreaking tragedy. Is the worse than never breaking in is breaking in and then washing out and not being able to hang on to it. And I think that was always the fear that I had after I broke in. So I think that would be the thing I would just go back and tell myself 15 years ago, just to stay at it, and it was all going to be okay. Because I think just the confidence of knowing that, okay, it's going to be a lot of work and there are going to be ups and downs, but you'll hang in. I think that would have removed a lot of anxiety and probably added a lot of hair to my head over the years.
Speaking of that, let's jump into the House of the Dragon. In terms of innovating, I'm curious what kind of pressures you felt on the early days of the project, because I think you pitched Dunk and Egg first, right? Before it kind of became what it is now. So,
I did.
Those pressures like?
Yeah, I pitched. I mean, I everybody at this point knows that I was unapologetic super nerd for George R. R. Martin's world, and I read his books multiple times, and I particularly Dunk and Egg, which other than the original books, was my favorite thing of his. And it happened in Westeros, and it was a different story. It's a completely different tone and feeling. And years before I actually got this job, I had pitched that to HBO when they first started investigating hey, what are we going to do when Game of Thrones comes to an end? What's the next series? And HBO had come to me just because I had read the reputation around town of being an unapologetic super nerd in George R. R. Martin's world. And I still, frankly, love the idea of that story as a counterpoint to the original Game of Thrones, and frankly to what we're doing, because it just is it's more of a lone wolf and cub. It is more of the Mandalorian versus the the original Star Wars, where it's two guys making their way through this very complex and dangerous and highly political world that aren't necessarily political themselves, which I always thought was interesting as an adventure tale to tell with Westeros. But then, once House of the Dragon came along, I think that was more real immediately, I think, because it became it went from, oh, this is interesting, to, oh my God, I think they're actually going to pursue making this very quickly, which is great. But then I think the pressure is just realizing that you have to follow the Beatles, and how the hell do you follow the Beatles? And the answer is you don't. You make your own thing and hope that people will come along and watch it.
Well, and something that's really exciting about House of the Dragon is that it centers two women at the center of its story. And I was wondering if you could talk about the decision behind not only that, but also centering women behind the camera. We have Claire Kilner directing. It's very, following up Game of Thrones, you want it to be different but similar. And this is one way in which this feels distinct from the more ensemble, larger world of Game of Thrones.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is it. I mean, this is we have long said that this is whereas if the original Game of Thrones is a sprawling Homeric tale, this is really more of a Greek tragedy. This is more of the a Plato drama about one family tearing itself apart. So it lets you live in with individual characters more intimately than you would be able to in the original series, simply because you have to service more characters, because it's this very it's a story of diaspora and following characters all over the map as they slowly come back together, whereas this starts with characters and they're together and then slowly breaks them apart. There are two women at the center of it. I would say that was kind of baked into the DNA of this story. The very first novella that George ever published out of the Targaryen history was called The Princess and the Queen, and it told the story of Rhaenyra and Alicent as adults, Alicent as her stepmother, having married her father after having grown up together at court. So those things were always built into it. I think what we did was decided to go back deeper into their history and tell the story of these two women as young girls, and make them peers that had grown up together and were quite fond of each other and had a close friendship, only to have it broken apart by the male pressures around them, the pressure of the patriarchy, particularly their fathers, who both have political responsibilities in their life, and in this world where marriage is duty and power, seeing how those pressures get applied to them in their lives, and then seeing how it busts them apart. So that was always, frankly, part of this. I think us, centering on it was the correct thing to do, because it is, as you said, different from what the original series presented. And I think the success of House of the Dragon, if I have to put my finger on it, is offering up the same thing but in a different way to Game of Thrones, because people come to Game of Thrones now expecting a certain thing. They expect high political intrigue. They expect interesting, great characters who do unexpected but totally set up things all the time, and they want surprising storytelling. And I think that comes from centering on really hopefully well-drawn characters that you spend a lot of time with and get to know, and then get horrified when they start making questionable decisions.
And was it a conscious decision on your guys' part to have female directors come in and handle some of these episodes that are dealing with sex and intimacy, issues like that?
Yeah, so that was always really important to me, to us, to HBO, to have a fully represented cast and crew in the show, in front of and behind the camera. And I mean, my writing partner in the show, Sarah Hess, who I made no secret about, I could not have done the show without her. She was the very first person that I recruited in the building of the writing staff, because I knew I was making a show about two women. I have a wife. I have two daughters. I think I have forged through the female experience quite a bit as a man, but I am still a man, and I think it's important to see that perspective from the inside of somebody that was grew up a woman and was a mother and had all these experiences that I could not. I have seen from the outside, but not experienced internally, and I think it started there. And then in the filmmaking, certainly we wanted us to be able to tell a similar story. We had it's a show that involves multiple marriages and childbirths. It involves the coming of age of these two women and girls, and I think I had some things to say there as a storyteller. But I think having those other perspectives in the mix always makes the story more rich and textured and frankly, Claire, wonderful director, Geeta Patel, who directed episode 8, had just become a mom for the first time herself, coming into our show. We have multiple horrific childbirths, and although she didn't film one herself, did have something to say about it. Sarah, as a mother, had gone through childbirth and had lots to say about that subject, and making the childbed a battlefield, and all those themes that have come out in season 1. And my ability to tell stories as a fantasist at some point does. You do need that real perspective, whether you're doing research or whatever it is on a medieval battle or in midwifery. You want that real experience on the ground and what that was actually like, because it always makes it feel more real.
Yeah. Well, the show, again, speaking of innovation, the show is also diverse from a race perspective. And I'm curious about the decision to make the Valyrians black. Was that as simple as saying, like, listen, we don't want an all-white cast in this show?
No, I think it was not that simple. And I think the reason that it's been a successful choice, frankly, not everybody's ever gonna be happy, but the reason it was successful is because it was thought out. It wasn't just done perfunctorily, or it wasn't just done to tick a box, or to be seen as progressive, or to be seen as somebody that's covering off on the bases or anything like that. We wanted, it's 2022. It's a different era than these shows used to be made in. We have an incredibly diverse audience that's in not only across America, but in multiple countries that are speak all sorts of different languages that represent all the colors under the sun. And it was really important to see some of that reflected up on screen. This is a fantasy world. I think if this was a historical fiction piece, it would be a more nuanced discussion. But I think simply because this is a fantasy world, if we believe in dragons and shapeshifters and direwolves, we can believe that everybody in the story is not white. Right. And why we went to the Valyrians in particular was because that felt like the most fantastical race in the show, and it felt like these were a people from a lost continent that we don't really know that much about. We know they all have silver hair. We know they have an affinity for dragons, some of them, and we know they are seen as quoted in the books and in the show, closer to gods than to men. So what does that all look like? And it always stuck with me, this article that where George had talked about at first when he set out to write these books, considering making all of the Valyrians black, and that just as a way of a race of black people with silver hair, and that always really stuck with me as an image. And I said, well, Valyria was this enormous continent, very diverse and well populated nation that fell into the sea. Why couldn't there have been a line of black Valyrians in that story? And in this particular time period, we're not all that far removed from the Doom. It would be believable. And I think if you're willing to take that first sort of leap of suspension of disbelief, you really come to, it feels integrated and intrinsic to the show in a organic way. To me, I don't even really think about it anymore. And there's so many Valyrians in the show, having the Velaryon family, having the Sea Snakes family look different than the Targaryens is actually really helpful in the casting and in differentiating people on screen and remembering who's from what house, and maybe making it even clearer that Rhaenyra's children are of questionable parentage. I think there's a lot of visual benefits that come along with it, and because Corlys has such a rich and diverse family line himself, just simply making that one turn on him to cast Steve Toussaint, his entire family becomes then a diverse cast, and it's a really interesting way to populate the show with a bunch of different faces that you may not have seen in another high fantasy show or in the original series.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask about audience, because now the show is out and people love it, like the critics love it, the fans are digging it. But I'm curious from your perspective as a writer, when you are working on something that is meant to be consumed by an audience and meant to be presumably liked by them, how do you balance that with trusting that you are telling the right story, you are making the right decisions, especially with something like House of the Dragon, which is a built-in franchise? No, people are going to have opinions about it because they were very vocal about Game of Thrones. So how do you just personally balance that pressure?
I imagine a lot of people in my seat say they try not to think about it. I'm going to take the pat answer and say I try not to think about it. I mean, the easiest answer is, look, I am a huge fan. I think that is clear, if not from the 1,000 of other interviews that I've done, from this conversation too. I'm a huge fan. I take this world really seriously. It was really important to me as a fan of science and fiction and fantasy, as a budding writer. I found these books when I myself was trying to figure out how to work in storytelling as an art form myself, and they were hugely influential on me. And really, I mean, I honestly don't know whether I'm sitting here if I had not discovered those books when I did. So when I say that these are incredibly important to me, and George is incredibly important to me as an author and as a mentor and as an artist that I looked up to, and now as a friend, and now as a co-creator and a partner in this, I want to take care of his children, and look after them, and I want to do good service to them, to not only honor him and the work that he's done, but also honor the tens of millions of fans that he has of his books and of the original show that are all there because of him. And I take that on with I do not take that lightly. So for me, if I'm making the series that I think that I want to see and experience as a fan, and I'm doing something that I like and I am happy with and contented by, then I think that was always the bar that I set for myself. Make the series that I would want to see as a fan, and the rest will kind of fall into place. And so far, it feels like that approach, fidelity to George's material, making the changes where you need to in order to adapt it to a screen medium, has paid off.
Now you just have to do it again for season 2. Easy peasy.
Well, now it's easier because we've cast the show, and I don't have 4 different time periods to tell the show in. So season 2 becomes fun instead of an anxious climb up to a summit that might throw you off when you get to the top.
Well, we know Miguel's not coming back for season 2. How are you finding being sole showrunner on season 2, which I know is not your first go around? I know you have experience.
Yeah, but look, I mean, this show is bigger than anything that I've ever done. Frankly, it's bigger than anything other than David and Dan have ever done. I mean, they're the only ones that I think have experienced something at this level. But maybe Rings of Power, maybe some of these other series that are starting to come in all respect to those showrunners, because God, this is a really big, hard job. Thankfully, I have the experience of season 1 behind me. I learned a lot in the making of it. I have a wonderful team around me, a bunch of great directors and heads of department and artists and writers that have helped. And I'm really just going to lean on them to help service the vision that we set out to create in season 1 and to continue it into season 2.
You mentioned Rings of Power. I was curious that these shows came out at the same time. And I'm curious, just speaking to you as someone on quote-unquote Team House of the Dragon, how did that feel from your perspective? Did it feel like a bit of a Team Marvel, Team DC thing? Or was it, the more people watching fantasy, the better?
Yeah, I mean the second one. I'm a huge unapologetic Tolkien fan too. Surprise, surprise. I read Lord of the Rings and Silmarillion and The Hobbit multiple times through growing up. I saw the Peter Jackson movies multiple times in the theaters. Yeah, I love all that stuff. I love high fantasy, and frankly, I want to live in a world where there is room for all of these things to exist if they're good. I think the need for more well-made, expensive science fiction and fantasy on television is what all of us nerds want. And I don't think that somebody watching Rings of Power means that they're not watching House of the Dragon. I don't see it that way. I see one feeds the other, and I think the more good quality genre entertainment on television, the more it's going to draw in the general public who might not be so predisposed to watching this. I mean, I think we have to remember back to when Game of Thrones aired. There was a lot of resistance around, sort of normies watching that show because they thought it was silly or goofy, or like they didn't with this fantasy thing with dragons and direwolves and whatever. But they got sucked in by the adult way in which George and David and Dan told the story, the surprising turns in it, the way it actually turned fantasy on its ear. George, as a huge Tolkien fan, actually takes a lot of Tolkien's, if not, they weren't tropes when Tolkien wrote them, but they became tropes over the decades when everybody else tried to ape Tolkien, and turn them on their head and surprise people in a way, and that's what drew people into the show. So I think building off of that idea and taking this much more willing audience. People are much more willing now in 2022 than they were in 2011 to, put a Targaryen flag on the back of their car, or to admit that they watched the show at the water cooler at the at the hedge fund or whatever it is. This has made fantasy mainstream, and I think the more of these good high quality shows that come along make fantasy more mainstream, and then just makes a bigger audience. It means more of the shows can be made and be made in an interesting way that's not just popcorn mass entertainment. It's hopefully has something interesting to say.
And with the support of studios who are giving it the production value it deserves to serve.
Correct. And as we know, these shows are not cheap to make, and they're dangerous ventures because you have to invest a whole lot of money in upfront to figure out whether it works or not. So we want studios in a willing to take risk mode. We don't want them in a risk adverse mode because that's where good art comes from.
Yeah. Well, I think George has said this is somewhat of a close-ended story, and unlike Game of Thrones, the book of this is finished. How long do you see this running? Is it a couple more seasons? Is it a longer series?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that this series has as much mileage to be mined out of it. This particular story, the one that I'm telling right now, The Dance of the Dragons, as the original series, it doesn't have that breadth to it. Not to say it's any less interesting. I mean, I think it's a really great series, but I think also part of making a series is knowing when to drop the curtain on it and to call it an end. But I've always said the show is called House of the Dragon. It's not called The Dance of the Dragons, and I think there is a very rich 300-year Targaryen dynasty to mine many stories out of, and that is the thing that I think is the most promising for the future of fans of Westeros, is that George has written some deeply complex history that's 3 centuries long that begins with Aegon's conquest. Actually begins before Aegon's conquest with the story of the Targaryens leaving old Valyria because of the dream of one little girl. I mean, there's so many stories to be mined out of there that I think as long as there's a willing audience, there is plenty of Targaryen to come.
Well, let's hope they're all as good as House of the Dragon.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for letting me chew your ear off and taking part in this panel. We super appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks, Adam. I appreciate it.